she never asked for the spotlight. She never chased the cameras. And she never tried to ride the wave of a name the whole world already knew. But Annie Guthrie, she lived inside that name every single day. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a legend so enormous it blocks out the sun. A name stitched into the very fabric of American music, American struggle, American identity. A name taught in schools, sung at protests, carved deep into the culture, like initials etched into an old oak tree that refuses to fall. Now imagine that name is yours. And nobody, not once, ever stopped to ask how that actually felt. For decades, Annie Guthrie stayed quiet. She watched the documentaries get made. She watched the museums open their doors. She watched the world celebrate and analyze and mythologize her family, while she stood just off to the side, holding truths that nobody bothered to ask about. But silence has a breaking point, and Annie Guthrie has finally, unmistakably, reached hers. What she reveals is not what you expect. It is not a scandal. It is not a takedown. It is something far more powerful and far more rare. It is the truth, the quiet, complicated, deeply human truth behind one of the most iconic legacies in all of American history. Stay with us, because what Annie shares will change the way you hear that music. It will shift the way you understand that family, and somewhere along the way, it just might change something in you too. It does not appear on any official landmark map. No bronze plaque marks the front door. No tour buses slow down when they pass it. No gift shop sells postcards of its image. But if you truly know the Guthrie story, really know it, all the way down to the bone, then you already understand something important. This house is where everything began. Not the music, not the legend, but the family, the ordinary, struggling, deeply human family that the entire legacy was quietly built upon. She knew the world where her family name carried something enormous, something almost sacred to millions of people across the country. She heard her father's songs played on radios and at rallies. She saw his face printed on T-shirts and protest posters. She listened to professors, journalists, and musicians speak with absolute authority about who her family was, what they believed, and what they meant to the American story. Home was something different entirely. Home was complicated. Home was love and loss tangled together so tightly that you could not pull them apart with your bare hands. Home was the real story, the one that never made it into the documentaries, the one that got quietly edited out of the celebrations, the one that lived only in the memory of the people who were actually, truly there. She is soft-spoken, but precise. When she chooses a word, she means it completely. When she pauses before answering a question, that pause is not hesitation. It is respect for accuracy. She has spent a lifetime being careful with the truth, because she has watched the truth get distorted over and over again by people who loved the legend far more than they ever loved the reality behind it. And symbols, she learned early, are stripped of their imperfections. Symbols do not get tired. They do not make mistakes. They do not grieve badly or love imperfectly, or quietly struggle under the weight of what has been placed on their shoulders. Symbols just stand there, strong and clean and permanent. Her father was a person. Her grandparents were people. The cousins and the arguments and the kitchen table conversations and the long, unresolvable silences, all of it was real. All of it mattered. And for far too long, none of it was part of the story the world was ever allowed to hear. Not to tear anything down, not to rewrite history out of bitterness, or score old points, or reclaim credit for something, but simply, and this is the exact word she uses herself, simply to make the story whole. Because a legacy built only on myth eventually hollows out, but a legacy built on the full human truth, that one lasts forever. The very first thing Annie wants the world to understand is this. Her grandfather did not set out to be a legend. He set out to survive. That sounds simple, but Annie believes it is the single most important correction she can offer, because the myth of the heroic folk poet has slowly and completely replaced the reality of a man who was, for most of his life, genuinely desperate. He rode freight trains not because it was romantic. He rode them because he had no money. He played music in bars and on street corners not because he was driven by some grand, artistic mission. He played because sometimes music was the only thing standing between him and total collapse. Annie first heard these stories from her grandmother, stories told quietly, at the edge of the day, when the light came low through the kitchen window and everything felt just safe enough for honesty. Her grandmother had a memory like a vault, every detail stored, every date perfectly intact. And she was not a bitter woman. Annie wants to make absolutely certain of that. Her grandmother loved deeply and grieved deeply and held her family together through circumstances that would have broken most people entirely. But she had very little patience for the way the outside world had decided to interpret her life. The Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the endless open road. These things have been aestheticized in American culture to the point where they almost seem beautiful from the outside. But Annie grew up hearing what they actually felt like from someone who had truly lived them. They felt like fear, like not knowing, like watching your children's faces across a dinner table and quietly wondering whether you had ever done enough. Annie was 10 years old the first time she fully understood that her family was different, not different in the way that every family privately believes itself to be a little special, different, in a way that was confirmed and amplified by the outside world every single time she stepped beyond her own front door. A teacher played one of her grandfather's songs in class. The other kids did not yet know who Annie was. She sat very still and listened to a song she had heard hundreds of times at home and watched her classmates' faces as if seeing them for the first time. They were moved. Even at 10, she could see it clearly. Something in the music had reached them. A few heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted. The teacher smiled at Annie with that very particular kind of smile, warm, but loaded with something unspoken. The smile that said, "You are part of something larger than yourself. You carry something." Annie smiled back, because she knew, even at 10 years old, that this was the expected response. But walking home that afternoon, she couldn't stop thinking about the gap, the enormous, unsettling gap, between the song her teacher had played and the family she actually knew. The song was enormous. It was confident and clear and pointed straight at the horizon with certainty. Her family, the real one, the one she ate breakfast with every morning, was smaller than that, more fragile, and much, much harder to summarize. She did not know, at 10, how to talk about that gap. It would take her most of a lifetime to find the words, and those words, it turns out, are exactly the ones we have all been waiting to hear. There's a chapter of the Guthrie story that almost no one knows, not because it was hidden deliberately, not because anyone conspired to bury it, but because the people closest to it simply never felt that the world was ready to receive it with the kind of care and honesty it truly deserved. These were the years after the public celebrations had faded and quieted, after the biographies had been published, the albums reissued, the documentaries wrapped and aired. These were the years when the Guthrie family was finally left alone with each other, and with the very complicated reality of living inside a legacy that had been largely defined and shaped by strangers. He was a thoughtful man, deeply thoughtful, actually, far more than most people assumed, because he was also warm and funny and genuinely social, and people sometimes mistook that warmth for simplicity. But he spent years in quiet, private struggle with a fundamental question of identity. Who was he allowed to be, when the world had already decided what he was supposed to represent? The music helped. His own music, which carved its own path and never once tried to replicate the original legend, was an act of ongoing self-definition. Every song he wrote was, in its own quiet way, a declaration of independence, a way of saying, "I am also here. I am also real. My story also matters." Annie watched him do this work, year after year, and she carried it with her every step of the way. The hardest part of staying silent, Annie says, was watching inaccuracies slowly harden into established fact. She would read something, a profile, a program note, a chapter in a published history book, and find a detail slightly wrong. Nothing catastrophic, but wrong in the particular way that small errors compound over time, each one building on the last, until the portrait assembled no longer quite matches the actual person who once lived and breathed. She wanted to speak up. Many times, she picked up the phone and held it. Many times, She started writing letters she never sent. But there is a particular, suffocating kind of loneliness in being the keeper of private truth. When the public myth is so beloved, people do not want corrections. They want the story they already love confirmed and deepened. They want more magic, not less. And the moment you introduce complexity, the moment you say, actually, it was a little more painful than that, you risk being seen as the person trying to diminish something beautiful. So she waited. She waited for the right moment, and the right words, and the confidence to know that she could tell the full truth, without the full truth being twisted into something she never intended. That moment has arrived. Not because everything is perfect, it is not, but because Annie finally decided that the silence itself was doing damage, that a legacy left entirely in the hands of people who were never inside it would eventually drift so far from reality that no one would be able to find their way back. One of the revelations that surprises people most, the one that catches them genuinely off guard, is how much laughter there was when people imagine the Guthrie household. They tend to imagine something serious, something heavy and weighted. They picture people who were always conscious of history, always aware of their place in the larger American story, always visibly carrying the gravity of the name. There was tremendous joy in that house, she says. Tremendous silliness, arguments about absolutely nothing, meals that turned into concerts, and concerts that somehow turned back into arguments about nothing. Her grandmother had a sense of humor that was absolutely weaponized, dry and devastatingly precise, timed with perfect accuracy. Her father could be genuinely ridiculous in the very best possible way. The house was loud with people and music and noise, and love expressed in all the beautifully imperfect ways that real love always gets expressed. This matters deeply, Annie believes, because the relentless solemnity with which the legacy has been handled has made it, quietly, gradually, less accessible. When a family becomes purely symbolic, purely serious, purely historic, they stop being human beings. And when they stop being human beings, the actual lessons of their lives become harder to absorb, because people can no longer see themselves reflected anywhere in the story. At its deepest level, the Guthrie legacy is a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, under extraordinary pressure. But ordinary people laugh. Ordinary people are ridiculous sometimes. Ordinary people burn the toast, forget important dates, say the wrong thing at the worst possible moment, and have to go back and apologize. And ordinary people get up anyway. That, Annie says quietly, is the actual inheritance. There was a period in Annie's adult life when she stepped back from the family legacy, almost entirely. Not with anger, not dramatically. She did not make any announcement, write any letters, or burn any bridges. She simply, gradually, quietly, without fanfare, withdrew from all the public conversations happening around her family name, and focused her full energy on her own life instead. That sounds like something people say, like a line lifted straight from a film. But Annie means it in a very specific, concrete, practical sense. She needed to make decisions, career decisions, relationship decisions, the small daily decisions that slowly accumulate into a life, without stopping to ask herself what each one meant in the context of the legacy. She needed to simply be a person. This period lasted years, and it was, she says without hesitation, some of the most important time she has ever spent, because when she came back, when she finally allowed herself back into the larger conversation about who the Guthries were and what their story truly meant, she came back knowing exactly what she believed. She was no longer operating from obligation or external expectation. She was operating from genuine, tested conviction. She had measured herself against her own life, against her own choices and her own failures and her own hard-won understanding, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the values at the center of the Guthrie story were not merely inherited values. They were hers, earned independently, arrived at through her own experience, on her own terms. That discovery gave her something no biography, no documentary, no outside voice could ever give her. It gave her the right to speak. The truth about the Guthrie legacy, Annie says with quiet certainty, is that it has always been about far more than one man. This is perhaps the most central correction she wants to make. and the one she feels most deeply. The folk hero mythology has always narrowed itself around a single figure, the lone traveler, the lone voice, the lone visionary. And while that figure was real and genuinely extraordinary, reducing the entire story to one person has quietly, systematically erased a great deal of the actual history. Behind every song, there were conversations. Behind every conviction, there were arguments and influences, and people who pushed back, and people who believed, and people who asked the hard questions late at night when nobody was feeling particularly heroic. Her grandmother shaped that entire worldview profoundly. Annie speaks about this with a kind of quiet, controlled intensity that makes you understand immediately just how much it means to her. Her grandmother was not a background figure. She was not supporting cast. She was an intellectual and emotional force whose influence ran through everything, whose courage, in many ways, was the unsung and uncelebrated foundation beneath all the celebrated courage. The world already knows by name, not as a footnote, not as a wife, but as a full, complete human being who made real choices under real pressure, whose inner life was as rich, as complex, and as worthy of consideration as anyone else's in the story. This is the part of the legacy that Annie has decided she can no longer allow to stay. Invisible and unspoken, the women inside the Guthrie story were not behind it at all. They were inside it, every difficult, extraordinary step of the way. When Annie finally began speaking publicly, slowly, carefully, in small and intimate settings before she agreed to anything larger, she was not prepared for what happened. She expected skepticism. She expected people to feel fiercely protective of the myth, defensive about the corrections and complications she was gently introducing. She expected pushback, especially from those who had built careers on a particular, comfortable interpretation of the legacy and who would not easily welcome anything that disturbed it. People who had always felt, at some quiet level, that something was missing from the official story. People who had read the biographies cover to cover and sensed the edges were just a little too clean, a little too perfectly shaped. People who loved the music with everything they had but felt, without ever quite being able to articulate it, that the full humanity behind it had somehow been smoothed away. They were grateful for the rougher, realer picture. They were grateful for the laughter and the fear and the ordinary kitchen table moments that had never been written down. They were grateful for the grandmother finally given her full and proper due. They were grateful for the quiet years and the complicated feelings and the beautiful imperfections that made the whole story not smaller, but undeniably, powerfully larger. Annie always knew this. Deep down, she had always known. She just needed the world to be ready to hear it. And the world, it turns out, had been ready for a long time. It was just waiting for someone who had actually been there to finally say so. There is something quietly radical about telling the truth in an age that would rather keep the myth intact. Annie Guthrie did not break her silence to cause damage. She broke it to repair something, to close a gap that had been quietly widening for decades between what the world thought it knew and what actually happened, between the symbol and the living, breathing human being, between the legend and the living. And maybe that is worth sitting with, not just about the Guthries, but about all the stories we have inherited and passed on without question. Who is still silent right now? Whose version of events has never once been asked for? What would genuinely change if the people actually inside the story were finally allowed to speak in their own words? Because every legacy has an Annie, someone standing just off stage, holding the part of the truth that never made it into the official version. Someone who stayed quiet not out of indifference, but out of care, patiently waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right courage to step forward. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves music, history, or simply the idea that the full truth is always worth knowing, no matter how long it takes to arrive. And subscribe, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting, stories that have always deserved to be told whole.